ask our final speaker, Annie Mashon, who is a writer and former MI5 intelligence officer, to speak. After Annie, we'll open the floor to questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this. It's been very interesting hearing these different perspectives. What I would like to do tonight is just discuss really pathology, perhaps, of the intelligence agencies and how their sort of climate of working informs some of these human rights abuses that we see spilling out, not just in Pakistan, but also across the Middle East and increasingly even in our own country here. But just to set the scene, in the introduction Salma mentioned I'm a former intelligence officer for MI5. I worked there in the 1990s and there met a man called David Shaler. And after 5-6 years of working there, we had seen so many crimes and so many examples of incompetence that we resigned from MI5 and we went public. We blew the whistle on what was wrong with the intelligence community in the UK. And just to give you a flavour of some of the things we saw going wrong there, these included files on government ministers, which shouldn't have been held, illegal phone tapping operations in the UK, bombs that could and should have been prevented on UK streets when the IRA campaign was at its height in the 1990s. Also, the bombing of the Israeli embassy in the summer of 1994, which was blamed on 2 innocent Palestinian students studying in London who were wrongly convicted. And in fact, the official assessment of the MI5 senior officer who investigated this attack, his official assessment was that Mossad, the Israeli security service, had bombed its own embassy. It was a false flag attack. Now, this document was never disclosed during the trial of the 2 Palestinians, and they were both convicted wrongfully, in our view. Finally, though, the case that made David Shaler and I quit, and why we actually went public, was the MI6, which is the UK intelligence gathering agency which operates abroad, became involved in funding an assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in 1996. Now, manifestly, it didn't succeed. Gaddafi is now the new best friend of Western governments. But in this case, we had MI6 paying significant sums of money to an Islamic extremist group in Libya to try and assassinate Gaddafi. They did this illegally because they did not get permission from the Foreign Secretary to carry out this attack abroad, so it was illegal under UK law. And it obviously went wrong, and innocent people were killed in the attack, both in the blast itself and in the ensuing security shootout. So Shaler and I really couldn't imagine anything more heinous than our spy community getting involved in illegal assassination plots abroad and then killing innocent people. That's not why we signed up to work as counter-terrorism officers. So as I said, we resigned and we blew the whistle, and by doing that, we had to go on the run around Europe, and we had to live abroad for 3 years, and David went to prison twice for having the courage to try and expose spy crimes, both in France, where they tried to extradite him. He was imprisoned in 1998, and then after he came back voluntarily to the UK, he was put on trial under the Official Secrets Act and convicted and sent to prison. So I mention that just to sort of give you a little flavour of my background, but also because I think from that story there are certain themes which continue to resonate across the planet now in the wake of 9/11. And these themes are common, I think, to most intelligence agencies. But in the UK we sort of pride ourselves on it being the mother of democracies. And you know, we live in a democracy, we have civil rights. The accountability exists for the spies. Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't. And I think this lack of accountability, this very closed community within which the intelligence officers of MI5 and MI6 work, is leading to continuing problems. First of all, we're looking at a sort of closed community which has no ventilation. There is no avenue for criticism. There is no avenue for dissent or for questioning what those agencies are doing. So we end up with a self-perpetuating oligarchy where anyone who has ethical concerns ends up resigning, and though yes people who just say yes, we'll go ahead and we'll do what you tell us to do, are the ones who stay.
Cabinet, isn't it? So it's like the British cabinet. All the yes people stay there.
Perhaps it's a very, very British disease then. But certainly in the UK, intelligence agencies, they operate with no oversight and no accountability, so they can operate above the law, effectively, within our country. So this is a problem, I think, and I think this is one of the reasons why, for example, MI5 officers and MI6 officers are now being investigated for complicity in torture of terrorist suspects abroad. Because when I was working there in the 1990s, it was agreed within the community that people did not, the intelligence agencies did not get involved in torture because it did not work, it was counterproductive. Whereas, of course, now we're seeing them, at the very least, turning a blind eye to something which violates the most fundamental of human rights. And I hope that if they have been involved, that they are put on trial and convicted of such egregious crimes. But also, of course, we've seen that this lack of accountability, this lack of real meaningful oversight of the spies, means that they can feed in fake intelligence, false intelligence, and wrong intelligence, up to and including the case that took us into illegal wars in the Middle East. Now you have spies telling lies to take a country into a war which results in the deaths of over 1 million people. Why is there no accountability? Why are these people not being investigated and again put on trial for lying and put on trial for committing crimes that result in genocide, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity? And I think this goes back, as I said, to this sort of groupthink, this lack of willingness to question orders and this self-perpetuating oligarchy. So that's one theme I want to pull out from my time within the agency, but the main one I want to mention tonight, moving on to exactly what's going on in Pakistan, is to question the very basis for the war on terror itself. Now, we know we were lied to now to take us into the wars in the Middle East. But one of the things that David Shayler and I were blowing the whistle on is the concept of false terrorism attacks. So false flag attacks is a key phrase for that. For example, the Israeli embassy bombing, where Mossad carried it out. The Gaddafi plot, where it's blamed on Islamic extremists in Libya, but is carried out by MI6-funded agents. And this has been stood up. This is not just an allegation coming from David Shayler, from one whistleblower. This has been stood up by sources in the CIA, by leaked documents from MI6, and by French intelligence experts. This is something that happens regularly. It's happened in the war in Northern Ireland. It's happened historically. It's a perfectly standard weapon that spy agencies and governments can get involved in, is false flag terrorism. Of course, Alexander Litvinenko, the Russian former KGB colonel who was notoriously murdered in London with polonium-210 a few years ago, was always called a KGB dissident. He was a whistleblower as well. He fled Russia to come here to blow the whistle on the KGB. And what he was saying, actually, was that the bombing of the apartment blocks in Moscow in 1999 were carried out by the modern version of the KGB and blamed on Chechen rebels as a pretext for the Chechen invasion in the following year. So this is something that all countries get involved in, not just the Brits. So having blown the whistle on something similar, having an awareness of these sort of issues, I think any thinking person then has to say, well, what is the pretext for the war on terror, the wars in the Middle East, the erosion of our civil liberties in our countries, and the application of torture to innocent people globally? And of course, the answer always goes back to 9/11, the event that changed the world, the before and after. Now, I'm not going to make any wild claims tonight, but what I would say is that even the commissioners, the people who sat and investigated the attacks of 9/11, have come forward and said that they were set up to fail. There's been a leaked document which shows that the Condoleezza Rice and Philip Zelikow, the two people pulling together the commission, have actually said you're not allowed to investigate this subject, you're not allowed to investigate that subject, keep the focus narrow. So even the commissioners now are saying they don't really know what happened around 9/11. We need a new, an independent, an impartial and an international inquiry to look at those events because of the way they have been used and abused since as justification for so many crimes. So that's what we're looking at. And there are many, many professional groups now, architects, engineers, politicians, political leaders for 9/11 Truth, academics, professors, intelligence officers, questioning the very basis of what really happened that day. And one of those leading figures, and I do recommend you try and find some of his books, is a man called Professor David Ray Griffin, who has researched what is known about the facts of that case. And his latest book, interestingly, is looking at whether or not Osama bin Laden is still alive. Now, You may say, well, of course he is. We can see all these recordings coming out on Al Jazeera. But they're not established as bona fide recordings. And in fact, David Ray Griffin came to the conclusion that he died back in 2003, but his reputation and his persona is being kept alive as a sort of bogeyman in the media in order to frighten us into continuing with the war on terror. Now, this is what takes me on to the subject of Pakistan specifically, and I will be quick because I'm aware time is pressing.